The man was running through the forest with blood on his hands, though none of it was his. Behind him, the night cracked open with the sound of muskets. Dogs barked. Men shouted in English, sharp, angry words that echoed between the trees like iron striking bone. The ground was wet with autumn rain, and every step threatened to send him crashing into the leaves, to be caught, to be dragged back. He did not know the word America. He did not know this land would one day be called the United States. All he knew was that the world he had been born into, one ruled by kings, crosses, and chains, had followed him across the ocean, and it had not come in peace. That moment, lost to history, unnamed in textbooks, was one of millions that built a nation born not in a single declaration or single war, but in fear, hunger, faith, violence, hope, and contradiction. A nation that promised liberty while practicing slavery, that spoke of equality while erasing entire peoples, that called itself new while carrying the oldest human sins. This is not a myth. This is not a legend. This is the true story of how the United States of America came into existence, not as a polished monument, but as a living, bleeding thing. Long before 13 colonies existed, before maps had borders and flags, this land was already full. For more than 10,000 years, indigenous nations lived across the continent. They were not a single people. They were hundreds of distinct civilizations: Haudenosaunee, Powhatan, Cherokee, Lakota, Apache, Pueblo, and countless others, each with their own languages, laws, religions, and systems of governance. They farmed, hunted, traded, debated, and fought. They built cities larger than most Europeans could imagine. Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, once had a population greater than London in the 1100s. They understood astronomy, medicine, agriculture, and diplomacy. Land was not owned, it was stewarded. Then, in 1492, a mistake changed everything. Christopher Columbus did not discover America. He collided with it, and what followed was not exploration, but catastrophe. European diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, ripped through native populations with apocalyptic speed. In some regions, up to 90% of indigenous people died within a century. Entire cultures vanished without leaving written records. The land emptied not because it was uninhabited, but because its people were killed by microbes before they ever saw a musket. Europe saw opportunity. Spain came first, carving an empire with swords and crosses. France followed, trading furs and forming alliances. England arrived later, desperate, divided, and hungry. By the early 1600s, England was in crisis. Land was scarce, jobs were scarce, religious conflict was everywhere, the poor were surplus. The crown needed somewhere to send them. So England looked west. In 1607, a group of English settlers established Jamestown in Virginia. They were not heroic pioneers. Most were gentlemen who had never farmed a day in their lives. They expected gold. They expected servants. They expected the land to bend. It did not. Jamestown nearly collapsed. Starvation became routine. During the winter of 1610, then later called the Starving Time, settlers ate rats, leather, and, according to evidence, even the dead. They survived only because of native assistance, food, knowledge, diplomacy, and then they repaid it with theft, violence, and betrayal. This pattern would repeat for centuries. Further north in 1620, another group arrived, the Pilgrims. Unlike Jamestown settlers, they were religious separatists fleeing persecution. They sought freedom to worship as they wished. They landed at Plymouth, cold, unprepared, and dependent on indigenous help. Squanto, a Patuxet man who had survived slavery in Europe, taught them how to plant corn, how to fish, how to survive. The Pilgrims thanked God. Then they took the land. The famous Thanksgiving myth hides a brutal truth. Within decades, New England was consumed by war. King Philip's War, 1675 to 1678, was one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history. Entire native villages were wiped out. Men, women, and children were sold into slavery. Heads were displayed on spikes. This was not an accident. This was the foundation. As colonies grew, so did labor demands. Indigenous people were dying. European indentured servants were temporary. So colonists turned to Africa. In 1619, a ship arrived in Virginia carrying about 20 enslaved Africans. At first, slavery was not yet fully codified. Some Africans gained freedom, some owned land. That would not last. By the late 1600s, colonial laws hardened. Slavery became racial. Blackness became synonymous with bondage. Whiteness became a legal shield. A system was born, one that would shape every aspect of American history. Plantations spread across the South. Tobacco, rice, indigo, and later cotton generated immense wealth. That wealth built ports, universities, banks, and governments. Northern merchants profited as much as Southern planters. The entire Atlantic economy became dependent on enslaved labor. Meanwhile, enslaved people resisted constantly. They ran, they rebelled, they preserved languages, music, and faith. They survived in a system designed to break them. By the mid-1700s, the colonies were thriving but restless. They were British but not equal. Parliament taxed them without representation. Trade was restricted. Governors were appointed, not elected. Colonists who once saw themselves as English subjects began to see themselves as something else. Ideas mattered. The Enlightenment spread radical concepts, natural rights, social contracts, government by consent. Pamphlets circulated, taverns buzzed with debate. Men like Samuel Adams, Thomas Paine, and Benjamin Franklin weaponized words. Then came sparks: the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party. In 1775, war broke out. Farmers, merchants, and lawyers faced the most powerful empire on earth. They were divided, undertrained, and undersupplied. Many did not want independence at all. But once blood was shed, there was no turning back. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson wrote words that would echo through history: "All men are created equal." He wrote them while owning human beings. The Declaration of Independence was both revolutionary and hypocritical. It challenged monarchy, yet protected slavery. It inspired liberation movements worldwide, yet excluded women, Native Americans, and Black people. The Revolutionary War was long and brutal. Battles were lost. Soldiers froze. Washington nearly quit. Victory came not just from courage, but from French money, weapons, and fleets. In 1783, Britain surrendered. The United States was born not as a finished nation, but as an experiment, and almost immediately it began to fracture. The Constitution that followed was a masterpiece of compromise and moral failure. It created checks and balances, but also counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person. It avoided the word slavery, yet protected it at every turn. The new nation expanded westward, driven by belief and greed. Manifest Destiny declared it God's will to conquer the continent. Native nations were pushed, broken, and removed. Treaties were signed and violated. The Trail of Tears killed thousands. Gold justified genocide. Progress demanded erasure. At the same time, the nation grew richer and more divided. By the 1800s, the question could no longer be avoided. Could a country founded on liberty survive while enslaving millions? The answer would come in fire.
By the middle of the 19th century, the United States was no longer a fragile experiment. It was a sprawling, loud, ambitious nation stretching from the Atlantic toward the Pacific, devouring land at a speed no empire had ever matched. Railroads cut through forests, steamboats churned rivers, cities rose where wilderness had stood only decades before. But beneath the noise of progress, the country was rotting from the inside. Slavery was no longer just a moral question. It was an economic engine, a political weapon, and a cultural identity. The Southern states were built on it. Their wealth, their social order, their sense of honor depended on the ownership of human beings. Cotton was king, and enslaved labor was its crown. In the North, slavery was fading, but racism was not. Northern factories depended on Southern cotton. Banks financed plantations. Shipyards built slave ships. Many Northerners opposed slavery not because they believed black people were equal, but because they feared competition. The nation was balanced on a knife's edge. Every new territory raised the same explosive question: free or slave? Missouri, Kansas, Texas. Each compromise delayed the inevitable, but only barely. Violence erupted in Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers killed each other in a miniature civil war years before the real one began. Words grew sharper. Politics became poisonous. And then came a man who did not look like a savior. Abraham Lincoln was tall, awkward, and painfully self-aware. He was born in a log cabin, educated by borrowed books, shaped by poverty and loss. He hated slavery, but he was cautious. He believed it was wrong, yet feared the nation could not survive its sudden abolition. When he won the presidency in 1860, without winning a single Southern state, the South saw it as an existential threat. One by one, Southern states seceded. They formed the Confederate States of America, built explicitly to preserve slavery. They claimed states' rights, but their own constitution made slavery permanent and unchallengeable. The Union shattered. In April 1861, Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. It would become the deadliest conflict in American history. Brother fought brother. Neighbors faced neighbors across battle lines. Boys as young as 15 marched into hell, carrying rifles taller than themselves. Disease killed more soldiers than bullets. Bodies piled so high that the nation ran out of coffins. Lincoln struggled to hold the Union together. Generals failed him. The public doubted him. Casualties mounted. At first, the war was about preserving the Union, not ending slavery. But war changes meaning. As enslaved people fled plantations and sought refuge behind Union lines, the conflict transformed. Black men demanded the right to fight. Abolitionists pushed Lincoln harder. Europe watched closely. In 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free all enslaved people, but it changed the soul of the war. The Union was now fighting for freedom, not just unity. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors joined the Union cause. They fought bravely, often for less pay, facing execution if captured. Their blood paid for a promise the nation had long denied them. In 1865, after years of slaughter, the Confederacy collapsed. Slavery was abolished. The 13th Amendment ended legal bondage. And then, just days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The man who had carried the nation through its darkest hour was gone. The peace he might have shaped died with him. What followed was not healing, but betrayal. Reconstruction promised a new America. Formerly enslaved people voted, held office, built schools, and claimed citizenship. For a brief moment, a multiracial democracy flickered into existence in the South. Then white resistance rose. Through violence, terror, and law, the old order reasserted itself. The Ku Klux Klan burned homes and lynched black leaders. Federal troops withdrew. Jim Crow laws spread like poison. Slavery was gone, but its shadow remained. Segregation became the law of the land. Separate and equal was a lie enforced by courts and mobs. Black Americans were trapped in poverty, denied education, and terrorized for daring to challenge the system. The nation moved on. The late 19th century brought industrial revolution. Immigrants poured in from Europe, Irish, Italian, Jewish, Polish, Chinese, fleeing famine, war, and persecution. They worked in factories, mines, and railroads under brutal conditions. Cities exploded with life and filth. Children labored, workers died. Fortunes were made by men who would be called robber barons, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, while millions lived one injury away from starvation. The American dream glittered, but only for some. Labor unions rose and were crushed. Strikes turned violent. Soldiers were deployed against workers. The government consistently chose capital over people. Still, the country pushed forward. By 1898, the United States had begun to look outward. The Spanish-American War marked the nation's arrival as an imperial power. Territories were taken. Flags were raised in distant lands. The rhetoric of freedom masked the reality of conquest. At home, women were still denied the vote. Native Americans were confined to reservations, their cultures targeted for destruction. Chinese immigrants were barred by law. America called itself the land of opportunity, but opportunity was carefully rationed. Then the 20th century arrived with thunder. World War I dragged the United States onto the global stage. Young men crossed the ocean to fight a war they barely understood. When they returned, they found a nation gripped by fear of immigrants, radicals, and change. The roaring 20s followed. Jazz, automobiles, skyscrapers, excess. Money flowed. Optimism soared. Then it all collapsed. In 1929, the stock market crashed. Banks failed. Jobs vanished. Families starved. Bread lines stretched for blocks. The Great Depression shattered faith in unchecked capitalism. Franklin Roosevelt reshaped the role of government. The New Deal built infrastructure, created jobs, and offered hope. It did not end racism or inequality, but it saved capitalism from itself. Then came another war. World War II consumed the globe. After Pearl Harbor, the United States mobilized completely. Factories roared. Women entered the workforce. Soldiers stormed beaches and jungles. The nation fought fascism abroad while practicing segregation at home. Japanese Americans were imprisoned in camps without trials. Black soldiers served in segregated units. Native lands were used without consent. Victory came in 1945, but at a terrible cost. Atomic bombs erased cities. The world entered a new age of fear. The United States emerged as a superpower. But power brought new conflicts. The Cold War turned ideology into a battlefield. Korea burned. Vietnam bled. Young Americans protested wars they no longer believed in. Trust in government eroded. At home, the civil rights movement rose. Black Americans refused to wait any longer. They marched, sat in, boycotted, and bled. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of dreams, while others spoke of revolution. Change came slowly and violently. Laws were passed. Segregation was outlawed. Voting rights were protected. But racism did not disappear. It adapted. The late 19th century saw prosperity and pain intertwined. Technology surged. Inequality widened. Prisons filled. Cities fractured.
The war on drugs devastated communities. Then came September 11th, 2001. The illusion of safety shattered. Towers fell. Wars followed. Fear reshaped policy. Liberty was traded for security. The 21st century arrived burdened with the weight of everything before it. America remained a paradox. A nation built on freedom, yet haunted by injustice. A country of innovation and inequality, of ideals and contradictions. The story was not finished. It never is.
The United States entered the modern age carrying ghosts. They lived in laws written decades earlier, in neighborhoods divided by invisible lines, in schools funded by zip codes, in prisons filled beyond capacity, in flags raised and burned for different reasons by different hands. The country had survived wars, depressions, and revolutions of industry, but it had never fully confronted the contradictions buried in its foundation. Instead, it learned to live with them. After the civil rights victories of the 1960s, many Americans believed the great moral battles were over. Laws had changed, signs came down, cameras captured handshakes and speeches. The nation wanted to believe it had redeemed itself. But history does not dissolve so easily. As factories closed in the 1970s and 1980s, entire cities hollowed out. Jobs vanished overseas, unions weakened, wages stagnated. A new economy emerged, one driven by finance, technology, and speculation. Wealth concentrated at the top at levels not seen since the Gilded Age. At the same time, political rhetoric hardened. The idea of small government rose, even as surveillance expanded. Social programs were cut. The war on drugs escalated, criminalizing addiction and turning policing into a battlefield. Prisons filled with the poor, the marginalized, and disproportionately Black Americans. The United States became the world's largest jailer. This was not an accident. It was policy. Neighborhoods already damaged by redlining and disinvestment were flooded with aggressive law enforcement. A minor offense could become a life sentence. A single mistake could erase a future. Generations grew up with fathers and brothers missing, not because of war, but because of laws written far from their streets. Meanwhile, technology accelerated everything. The internet rewired communication. Information became infinite, and so did misinformation. Social media collapsed distance and deepened division. Every grievance found an audience. Every belief found reinforcement. America became louder, faster, angrier. The attacks of September 11th had already shifted the nation's psychology. Fear justified war. Surveillance became normal. Torture was debated. The Middle East burned through cycles of invasion and instability. Soldiers returned with invisible wounds. Trust in institutions eroded further. At home, economic crises struck again. In 2008, the financial system collapsed under its own greed. Banks were saved, millions lost homes, retirement accounts evaporated. The promise that hard work guaranteed security rang hollow. Anger spread, quiet at first, then loud. Some turned to hope. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected president. For many, it felt like a turning point, a sign that the country could transcend its past. A Black president, born of a multiracial background, speaking the language of unity. For others, it felt like a threat. Old resentments resurfaced under new names. Conspiracy theories flourished. Political identity hardened into tribalism. The idea of a shared reality began to fracture. America did not move forward together. It splintered. Economic inequality widened further. The top accumulated wealth at breathtaking speed, while wages for most barely moved. Healthcare remained tied to employment. Education became debt. Housing became speculation. Then came another shock. In 2020, a virus brought the world to a halt. Streets emptied, hospitals overflowed, millions died globally. In the United States, the pandemic exposed every fault line at once: race, class, healthcare, trust, leadership. Essential workers were praised and sacrificed. Remote work protected some, while others faced constant risk. Death rates followed old inequalities. And then, once again, violence forced the nation to look at itself. A man died beneath a police officer's knee, filmed by a stranger. The footage spread across the world. Protests erupted in every state. Statues fell. Streets filled with voices that had waited centuries to be heard. Some demanded justice. Others demanded order. The same argument replayed itself, older than the country itself. What is America for? And who is it for? Elections became existential battles. Truth became contested. The Capitol itself was breached by citizens convinced the system had betrayed them. Allies watched in disbelief. Enemies watched with interest. Yet even in fracture, life continued. Scientists developed vaccines in record time. Communities organized mutual aid. Artists documented the moment. Teachers adapted. Nurses endured. Parents struggled. Children grew up faster than they should have. America, as always, was many things at once. It was cruelty and compassion, innovation and inertia, memory and denial. The country was never a single story. It was a collision of stories: native, African, European, Asian, immigrant, enslaved, free, layered, and unresolved. The man running through the forest centuries ago did not know any of this. He could not imagine skyscrapers or satellites. He did not know constitutions or amendments, but he understood something fundamental: that power follows people across oceans, that freedom is claimed, not given, that history is made not only by presidents and generals, but by those whose names are never recorded. The United States was not born perfect. It was born unfinished, and it remains so. Its future will not be decided by nostalgia or fear, but whether it can finally face itself honestly, completely, and without myth. Because the story of America is not about what it says it is. It is about what it chooses to become.
America has always been a country arguing with itself. Not quietly, not politely, but loudly, endlessly, and in public. From its earliest days, disagreement was not a flaw in the system, it was the system. The founders themselves distrusted unity if it came at the cost of conscience. They built a nation expecting conflict, assuming ambition would collide with ambition, believing friction could produce balance. What they did not anticipate was scale. As the United States grew, so did the distance between its people, not just geographically, but emotionally, culturally, morally. The frontier closed, but the idea of the frontier moved inward. It became psychological, political, cultural. Who belongs? Who decides? Whose version of America is real? These questions never stopped echoing. Religion, once a refuge from European persecution, became a defining force. Waves of revival swept the nation, convincing millions that America was not just a country, but a divine project. Others rejected this entirely, arguing that faith and power were a dangerous mix. Both sides claimed the founders. Both quoted the same documents. Both believed the future depended on winning. Culture wars replaced battlefields. Music, books, classrooms, sports, even science became contested territory. What children were taught, what history was remembered, what words were acceptable, what symbols were sacred. To some, change felt like erasure. To others, resistance felt like oppression. The media evolved alongside the conflict. Newspapers became networks. Networks became algorithms. Outrage became profitable. Fear traveled faster than facts. Identity hardened into brand. People stopped arguing to persuade, they argued to perform. Yet beneath the noise, ordinary lives continued. Millions woke early, worked long hours, raised families, and tried to make sense of a country that felt increasingly unrecognizable. Immigrants still arrived, chasing versions of the dream that had survived centuries of disappointment. Refugees carried trauma and hope in equal measure. The United States remained a magnet, not because it was perfect, but because it was possible. Still, possibility came at a cost. Climate change reshaped landscapes, hurricanes intensified, fires swallowed towns, droughts cracked farmland. Scientists warned, politicians delayed. The future crept closer, undeniable and expensive. Technology, once a promise, became a mirror. Artificial intelligence, automation, and data reshaped labor. Jobs vanished faster than new ones appeared. Privacy eroded quietly. Convenience replaced consent. The question returned again, louder than before. What does freedom mean in a world where power is invisible? America had answered that question before, with amendments, movements, and blood. It would have to answer it again. History offered no comfort. Every generation believed it stood at the edge of collapse. Some were right. The Civil War nearly ended the nation. The Great Depression almost broke its faith. The Cold War threatened annihilation. But survival was not the same as resolution. The United States did not solve its problems. It endured them. Sometimes endurance looked like progress. Sometimes it looked like delay. Young people grew skeptical of institutions that had failed them. They questioned capitalism, borders, policing, and patriotism itself. Older generations feared the loss of stability, tradition, and meaning. Each accused the other of destroying the country. Neither fully understood the weight they carried. America was not single inheritance. It was many, layered and conflicting. It was the inheritance of stolen land and stolen labor, of bold ideas and brutal enforcement, of generosity and exclusion. To love the country required reckoning with all of it. That was the part many avoided. Patriotism was easier when simplified, when flags replaced facts, when history ended where pride began. But the deeper truth was more demanding. The United States was strongest when it expanded its definition of we. Every major leap forward followed that pattern: abolition, suffrage, civil rights, labor protections. Each was resisted, each was delayed, each was declared dangerous, each became inevitable. The future would follow the same rhythm, not smoothly, not peacefully, but persistently. The man running through the forest at the beginning of this story never reached safety. History swallowed him without a name. But his fear, his hope, his struggle were not wasted. They became part of something larger. A country that learned, slowly and painfully, that power without justice corrodes, and freedom without equality fractures. The United States remains unfinished because it was designed to be challenged. Its greatest danger has never been division, but denial. As long as Americans argue, organize, vote, protest, create, and care, the story continues. Not towards perfection, but towards possibility. And possibility, fragile and demanding, is the most American idea of all.
There is a moment in every nation's life when history stops feeling distant and starts feeling personal. For the United States, that moment has repeated itself countless times, in kitchens and classrooms, in factories and fields, in courtrooms and hospital hallways. It is the moment when a decision made far away by people whose names you may never know arrives at your door and changes your life. A draft notice, a foreclosure letter, a police siren, a layoff email, a ballot. History does not move only through presidents and wars. It moves through ordinary people who adapt, resist, endure, and sometimes break. Consider the factory worker in the Midwest in the late 20th century. His father had worked the same line for 30 years, raised a family, bought a home, believed in stability. When the plant closed, there was no parade of explanations, just silence, a locked gate, and a future that no longer made sense. Or the immigrant mother working 2 jobs, navigating a language she learned too late, teaching her children to believe in a country that did not always believe in them. She told them America was opportunity, even as she cleaned offices she would never enter as an equal. Or the black teenager learning early how to make himself smaller, quieter, safer, how to survive encounters his peers never had to think about. He inherited a fear passed down like a family heirloom, older than the nation itself. These stories do not appear in monuments, but they are the nation. For much of American history, the promise of upward mobility functioned as a kind of social glue. You might start with little, but your children would have more. That belief endured wars, depressions, and cultural upheaval. When that belief began to fail, trust eroded. By the early 21st century, many Americans felt trapped between nostalgia and uncertainty. The past was idealized, the future felt abstract and threatening. Political language shifted from solutions to enemies. Every side claimed victimhood. Every side claimed truth. The Constitution, once a shared reference point, became a weapon. The courts became battlegrounds. Facts became flexible. Reality fragmented. And yet, life continued. Teachers showed up to underfunded classrooms. Doctors treated patients who could not afford care. Firefighters ran toward danger. Volunteers filled gaps left by policy. Neighbors helped neighbors when systems failed. America functioned because of quiet resilience, not loud speeches. This resilience had always been there. It existed in enslaved people who preserved humanity under dehumanization, in native nations who maintained culture despite attempted erasure, in women who organized without the vote, in workers who struck without protection. Progress was never given, it was taken, increment by incremental step. The future, like the past, would not arrive cleanly. Technology promised efficiency, but delivered displacement. Automation threatened livelihoods. Artificial intelligence challenged notions of creativity and labor. The question of human worth resurfaced in new forms. What is a person worth when machines outperform them? The United States had faced this question before, during industrialization, during globalization, but each time it answered incompletely. The costs were absorbed by the vulnerable, the benefits accumulated upward. History warned what happened next. Inequality breeds instability. Instability invites authoritarian temptation. Authoritarianism feeds on fear. The American system was designed to resist this cycle only if people engaged it honestly. Democracy was not self-sustaining. It required participation, compromise, and an uncomfortable acceptance of pluralism. That acceptance had never been easy. The country had always struggled with difference of race, religion, language, ideology. Sometimes it responded with expansion, other times with exclusion. Which response would define the next chapter? The answer was not written yet. It would be written by choices, whether to invest in education or punishment, healthcare or profit, truth or comfort, whether to confront history or sanitize it.
Every generation inherits a version of America shaped by the decisions of those before them. They are not responsible for its origins, but they are responsible for its direction. That responsibility cannot be delegated. The man running through the forest centuries ago could not vote, protest, or publish. His choices were survival or death. Modern Americans inherited tools he never had, but also burdens he could not imagine. The question remained the same. What will you do with the freedom you inherit? The story of the United States has never been about arrival. It has been about movement, forward, backward, sideways, driven by human choices made under pressure. The next chapter is already being written, quietly, daily, by people who may never think of themselves as historical actors. But they are.
Every empire believes it is an exception to history. The United States is no different. From Rome to Britain, from dynasties to ideologies, powerful nations have always convinced themselves that decline was something that happened to others. Corrupt monarchies, decadent elites, distant civilizations that failed to adapt. America told itself a different story. It was not an empire, but a republic. Not conquerors, but liberators. Not bound by bloodlines, but by ideas. That belief became both its strength and its vulnerability. Ideas are powerful. They inspire sacrifice. They justify endurance. But ideas can also become shields, protecting people from uncomfortable truths. When reality contradicts belief, nations face a choice: revise the belief or reject the reality. For much of the 21st century, America hesitated between the two. Global power shifted, other nations rose, supply chains stretched thin. Wars no longer looked like victories, they looked like endless expenditures of lives and money. Faith in expertise declined. Institutions once trusted began to feel distant, unaccountable, hollow. The phrase American decline entered the vocabulary, not as prophecy, but as anxiety. Yet history rarely moves in straight lines. The United States had been pronounced finished before, after the Civil War, after the Great Depression, after Vietnam, after 9/11. Each time it adapted, not by erasing conflict, but by absorbing it. Adaptation, however, is painful. It requires admitting that systems built for a different century cannot solve the problems of the present one, that economic rules written for factories fail in a digital world, that borders mean less in a climate crisis, that democracy designed for pamphlets struggles in an age of algorithms. The American Constitution, admired worldwide, was also fragile. It assumed good faith. It relied on norms. It expected restraint. History showed what happened when those assumptions failed. The courts became ideological battlegrounds. Elections became tests of legitimacy rather than mechanisms of choice. Law became strategy. Governance became spectacle. And yet, people still voted, not because they were confident, but because the alternative was surrender. The United States has always survived on participation rather than consensus. Agreement was rare. Engagement was essential. Outside politics, culture continued to evolve. Music, film, and art reflected fragmentation and hybridity. American culture no longer flowed outward from a single center. It became decentralized, remixing global influences, shaped as much by immigrants and outsiders as by tradition. This unsettled some. It energized others. America's identity was no longer easily defined. It could not be reduced to a single language, religion, or story. Attempts to force such simplicity back onto it failed repeatedly. Pluralism was not a phase, it was the condition. The question was whether the nation could build solidarity without sameness. History offered clues. The most stable periods in American life followed moments of inclusion when the circle widened just enough to reduce pressure without eliminating tension. The New Deal did this economically. Civil rights did this legally. Immigration reform did this demographically. Each expansion triggered backlash. Each backlash tested the system. The future would repeat the pattern. Climate change loomed as the great equalizer and divider. No wall could stop rising seas. No ideology could negotiate with physics. The costs would be uneven. The responses would be political. Technology would accelerate the divide between those who could adapt and those who could not. Education would matter more than ever. So would access to health care, housing, and stability. The United States could lead or fragment. History does not choose. People do. The man running through the forest never knew what his struggle would become, but his life, like millions of others, formed the invisible foundation of a nation that never stopped asking itself who it was. America's true story is not found in triumph or tragedy alone. It is found in endurance, in the refusal to fully give up even when faith wavers, in the insistence that the future can still be argued over rather than imposed, in the belief, often irrational, sometimes reckless, that tomorrow can be shaped. That belief has carried the nation through its worst moments. It will be tested again. And when it is, the United States will not be saved by nostalgia, power, or myth, but by the same force that has always mattered most: people choosing, imperfectly, stubbornly, to keep going.
In the end, the story of the United States does not conclude with a victory or a collapse. It ends and begins again with a choice. Every generation inherits a country they did not design. Laws written by the dead govern the living. Borders drawn by conquest define identity. Wealth accumulated long before birth determines opportunity before effort ever has a chance. No one consents to this inheritance. They wake up inside it. And then they decide what to do with it. America was never a promise fulfilled. It was a promise argued over, rewritten, betrayed, reclaimed, and challenged again. Its greatness was never purity, it was tension. The friction between what it claimed to be and what it actually was created motion. Without that friction, the country would have hardened into tyranny or dissolved into irrelevance. Instead, it endured. The native nations who survived erasure still speak their languages, still defend land, still remember a time before the flag. Their existence challenges the myth of beginning. They remind the country that history did not start in 1776. The descendants of enslaved people still fight for justice in a nation built partly by unpaid labor. Their presence challenges the myth of innocence. They remind the country that freedom was selective before it was expanded. Immigrants still arrive, carrying versions of hope that refuse to die. They challenge the myth of ownership. They remind the country that belonging is not inherited, it is practiced. The United States is not a finished structure. It is a construction site that never closes. Some come to build, some come to tear down. Most simply try to survive the noise. And yet, something persists. Not a uniform belief, but a stubborn insistence that the future is negotiable. This is why the country never fully sleeps, why its debates are loud, why its failures are public, why its contradictions are impossible to hide for long. Empires collapse when they no longer argue honestly with themselves. America still argues. That argument has cost lives, it has caused suffering, it has delayed justice, but it has also prevented silence, and silence is the most dangerous condition of all. The man running through the forest at the beginning of this story has no grave, no statue, no footnote.
He is forgotten in name, but not in consequence. He represents the millions who never chose this nation, yet shaped it with their fear, labor, resistance, and hope. They are the true authors. The United States was not born exceptional. It became influential because its failures were large, visible, and contested, because its ideals were written down, argued over, and used against those in power, because its people refused again and again to accept that the present was permanent. That refusal is fragile. It can become arrogance. It can become denial. It can become cruelty disguised as tradition. Or it can become responsibility. History does not ask whether America will remain powerful. Power shifts naturally. History asks a harder question. Will the United States remain human? Will it remember that its strength has never come from dominance alone, but from the dangerous idea that authority can be challenged, that leaders can be questioned, that injustice can be named aloud? These ideas are not guaranteed. They survive only if practiced. The future will not be kind. No future ever is. Climate will test cooperation. Technology will test dignity. Inequality will test solidarity. Truth will test courage. The nation will stumble. It always has. But the story is not over. Because somewhere, right now, a child is being taught a version of America that will either include or exclude, empower or silence, inspire or harden them. Somewhere, someone is choosing to speak up, to vote, to organize, to care, to leave, or to stay. Those choices matter more than monuments. In the end, the United States is not an idea you inherit. It is an argument you enter. And as long as people are willing to enter it, not to dominate, but to shape, the story continues. Not perfect, not pure, but alive.